The title of this talk is Semantic Inferentialism and Logical Expressivism. In it, I want to introduce a way of thinking about semantics that's different from more familiar ones, and on that basis, also a new way of thinking about logic. In case that seems insufficiently ambitious, I'll introduce those ideas by sketching a different way of thinking about some important episodes in the history of philosophy that stretches from Descartes to Kant. I'm going to explain and motivate the two ideas indicated in the title by putting together considerations drawn from three different thinkers, Frege, Dummett, and Sellers, or as I think of them, the sage of Jena, the sage of Oxford, and the sage of Pittsburgh. In each case, I'll be picking up strands other than those usually emphasized in reading these figures. Pre-Kantian empiricists and rationalists alike were notoriously disposed to run together causal and conceptual issues, largely through insufficient appreciation of the normative character of what Spinoza called the order and connection of ideas that matters for concepts. But there's another, perhaps less appreciated contrast in play during this period, besides that between the causal and the conceptual, the origin and the justification of ideas. Enlightenment epistemology was always the home to two somewhat uneasily coexisting conceptions of the conceptual. The fundamental concept of the dominant and characteristic understanding of cognitive contentfulness in the period initiated by Descartes is, of course, representation. However, there's a minority semantic tradition that takes inference rather than representation as its master concept. Rationalists such as Spinoza and Leibniz accepted the central role of the concept of representation in explaining human cognitive activity. But they were not prepared to accept Descartes' strategy of treating the possession of representational content as an unexplained explainer, just dividing the world into what by nature is a representing and what by nature can only be represented. Each of them developed instead an account of what it is for one thing to represent another in terms of the inferential significance of reasoning, of representing, its role in reasoning. They were explicitly concerned, as Descartes was not, to be able to explain what it is for something to be understood, taken, or treated, employed as a representing by the subject, what it is for it to be a representing to or for that subject, to be tanquam rem, as if of things, as Descartes puts it. And their idea was that the way in which representings point beyond themselves to something represented is to be understood in terms of inferential relations among the representings. States and acts acquire content by being caught up in inferences as premises and conclusions. So a big divide within Enlightenment epistemology concerns the explanatory priority accorded to the concepts of representation and inference. The British empiricists were more puzzled than Descartes was about representational purport, the property of so much as seeming to be about something. But they were clear in seeking to derive inferential relations from the contents of representings rather than the other way around. And in this regard, they belong to the still dominant tradition that reads inferential correctnesses off from representational correctnesses, which are assumed to be antecedently intelligible. That's why Hume, for instance, could take for granted the contents of individual representings, but worry about how those contents could possibly underwrite the correctness of inductive inferences. The post-Cartesian rationalists, I'm claiming, give rise to a tradition based on a complementary, semantically reductive order of explanation. So Kant, picking up the thread from this tradition, will come to see their involvement in counterfactually robust inferences as essential to empirical representations having the contents that they do. These, as I'm calling them, inferentialists, seek to define representational properties in terms of inferential ones, which accordingly must be capable of being antecedently understood. They start with a notion of content as determining what's a reason for what, and understand truth and representation as features of ideas that are not only manifested in, but in the end consist in, their role in reasoning. I actually think this division of pre-Kantian philosophers into representationalists and inferentialists cuts according to deeper principles of their thought than does the nearly coextensive division of them into empiricists and rationalists. But it goes beyond my brief to argue for that thesis here. The concepts for which inferential notions of content are least obviously appropriate are those associated with observable properties, paradigmatically colors. For the characteristic use of such concepts is precisely in making non-inferential reports, as when I notice that the ball is red. One of the most important lessons we can learn from Seller's masterwork, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, a lesson he'd learned already from the sense certainty section of Hegel's Phenomenology, is the inferentialist one that even non-inferential reports must be inferentially articulated. Without that requirement, we can't tell the difference between genuine non-inferential reporters and automatic machinery such as thermostats and photocells, which also have reliable dispositions to respond differentially to stimuli. What's the important difference between a thermostat that turns the furnace on when the temperature drops to 60 degrees, or a parrot trained to say that's red in the presence of red things, on the one hand, and a genuine non-inferential reporter of those circumstances, on the other? After all, each classifies particular stimuli as being of some general kind, the kind, namely, that elicits a repeatable response of a certain sort. In that sense, a chunk of iron classifies its environment as being of one of two kinds, depending on whether it responds by rusting or not. It's easy, but uninformative, to say that what distinguishes reporters from reliable responders is awareness. In this use, the term is tied to the notion of understanding. The thermostat and the parrot don't understand their responses. Those responses mean nothing to them, though they can mean something to us. This is right as far as it goes, but how helpful is it? When we can add that the distinction wanted is that between merely responsive classification and specifically conceptual classification. The reporter must, as the parrot and the thermostat do not, have the concept of temperature or cold. It is classifying under such a concept, something the reporter understands or grasps the meaning of, that makes the relevant difference. But here we need to know what that understanding, what that grasp of concepts consists in. And it's at this point that Sellers introduces his central thought, that for a response to have specifically conceptual content is just for it to play a role in the inferential game of making claims and giving and asking for reasons. To grasp or understand a concept is to have practical mastery over the inferences it's involved in. To know, in the practical sense of being able to distinguish, a kind of practical know-how, what follows from the applicability of the concept and what it follows from. The problem is the parrot doesn't treat that's red as incompatible with that's green, nor as following from that's scarlet and entailing that's colored. And insofar as the repeatable response is not, for the parrot, caught up in practical proprieties of inference and justification, reasoning to the making of further judgments, it's not a conceptual or a cognitive matter at all. Notice that it follows immediately from such an inferential demarcation of the conceptual that in order to master any concepts, one must master many concepts. For grasp of one concept consists in mastery of at least some of its inferential relations to other concepts. Cognitively, grasp of just one concept is the sound of one hand clapping. Another consequence is that to be able to apply one concept non-inferentially, one must be able to use it and others inferentially. For unless applying it can serve at least as a premise from which to draw inferential consequences, it's not functioning as a concept at all. So the idea that there could be an autonomous discursive practice, a language game one played though one played no other, that consisted entirely of non-inferential reports, where one did nothing but observe, is a radical mistake. Of course, that thought is compatible with there being languages that don't have any theoretical concepts, that is, concepts whose only use is inferential. There could be languages, all of whose concepts had observational uses, as long as they also have inferential ones. My purpose at the moment, though, is not to pursue the consequences of the inferential understanding of conceptual contents that Sellars recommends, but to look for a minute at its antecedents. And the predecessor I think it's most interesting to consider is the young Frege. He starts his semantic investigations not with the idea of reference or truth, but with that of inference. His seminal first work, the Begriffsschrift of 1879, takes as its aim the explication of what he calls conceptual content, begrifflicher Inhalt. And the qualification conceptual is explicitly construed in inferential terms. In the third paragraph of that work, he says, long quote now, "There are two ways in which the content of two judgments may differ. It may or it may not be the case that all the inferences that can be drawn from the first judgment when combined with certain other ones can always also be drawn from the second when combined with the same other judgments. The two propositions, the Greeks defeated the Persians at Plataea and the Persians were defeated by the Greeks at Plataea, differ in the former way. Even if a slight difference of sense is discernible, the agreement in sense is preponderant." Now, I call that part of the content that's the same in both the conceptual content. Only this has significance for our symbolic language, Begriffsschrift. In my Begriffsschrift, only that part of judgments which affects the possible inferences is taken into consideration. Whatever is needed for a correct inference is fully expressed, and what is not needed is not. End of that quote from Frege. For him, two claims have the same conceptual content, just in case they have the same inferential role, in case a good inference is never turned into a bad one by substituting one for the other. By contrast, the tradition Frege initiated later, in the 1890s, makes truth and reference rather than inference primary in the order of explanation. But the important thing to realize is that the young Frege had not yet made this false step. The kind of inference whose correctnesses determine the conceptual contents of its premises and conclusions may be called, following Sellars, material inferences. As an example, consider the inference from Pittsburgh is to the west of New York, so New York is to the east of Pittsburgh, and that from lightning is seen now to thunder will be heard soon. It's the contents of the concepts west and east that make the first a good inference, and the contents of the concepts lightning and thunder that make the second appropriate. Endorsing these inferences is part of grasping or mastering those concepts, quite apart from any specifically logical competence. Often, though, inferential articulation is identified with logical articulation, and material inferences are treated as a derivative category. That idea is that being rational, being subject to the peculiar normative force of the better reason, which so puzzled and fascinated the ancient Greeks, can be understood as a purely logical capacity. In part, I think the tendency to make this identification was encouraged by a merely verbally sloppy formulation of the crucial difference between the inferential force of reasons and the physically efficacious force of causes, which render it as something like the difference between logical and natural compulsion. But mistakes will ensue if the concept logical is employed with those circumstances of application conjoined with consequences of application that restrict the notion of the logical force of reasons to formally valid inferences. The substantial commitment that's fundamental to this mistaken sort of approach is what Sellars calls the received dogma, that the inference which finds its expression in it's raining, therefore the streets will be wet, is an enthymeme. That is, an inference that's only good if you supply a missing or suppressed premise. According to this mistaken line of thought, wherever an inference is endorsed, it's because of a belief in some underlying conditional. So the instanced inference is understood as implicitly involving the conditional, if it's raining, then the streets will be wet. With that suppressed premise supplied, the inference is an instance of the formally valid scheme of conditional detachment or modus ponens. What Sellers calls the dogma expresses a commitment to an order of explanation that treats all inferences as good or bad solely in virtue of their logical form, with the contents of the claims they involve mattering only for the truth of the implicit premises. According to this way of setting things out, there is no such thing as materially good inference. This view, which understands good inference to mean formally logically valid inference, postulating implicit premises as need be, might be called a formalist or logicist approach to inference. It trades primitive goodnesses of inference for the truth of conditionals. Doing so is taking the retrograde step. It's also what introduces the problem that Lewis Carroll exposes in his famous essay, Achilles and the Tortoise. The grasp of logic that's attributed must be an implicit grasp, since it need be manifested only in distinguishing material inferences as good and bad, and not in any further capacity to manipulate logical vocabulary or endorse tautologies involving them. But what then is the explanatory payoff from attributing such an implicit logical ability rather than just the capacity to assess proprieties of material inference? The approach Sellers endorses is best understood by reference to the full list of alternatives he considers. He says, quote, "We've been led to distinguish the following 6 conceptions of the status of material rules of inference. First, material rules are essential to meaning, and hence to language and thought, as essential as formal rules. Second, while not essential to meaning, material rules of inference have an original authority not derived from formal rules, and play an indispensable role in our thinking on matters of fact. 3, same as 2, save that the acknowledgement of material rules of inference is held to be a dispensable feature of thought, at best a matter of convenience. 4, material rules of inference have a purely derivative authority, but they are genuinely rules of inference. 5th, the sentences which raise those puzzles about material rules of inference are merely abridged formulations of logically valid inferences. And 6th, trains of thought which are said to be governed by material rules of inference are actually not inferences at all, but rather activated associations which mimic inference, concealing their intellectual nudity with stolen therefores." End of the quote from Sellers. His own position is that an expression has conceptual content conferred on it by being caught up in, by playing a certain role in material inferences. He says, quote, "It's the first or rationalistic alternative to which he's committed. According to it, material transformation rules determine the descriptive meaning of the expressions of a language within the framework provided by its logical transformation rules. In traditional language, the content of concepts as well as their logical form is determined by the rules of the understanding." Close quote. Well, should inferentialists begin with inferences pertaining to propositional form or those pertaining to propositional content? I think one important consideration is that the notion of formally valid inferences is definable in a natural way from that of materially correct ones, while there is no converse route. For given a subset of vocabulary that's privileged or distinguished somehow, an inference can be treated as good in virtue of its form with respect to that vocabulary, just in case it is a materially good inference and it can't be turned into a materially bad one by substituting non-privileged for non-privileged vocabulary in its premises and conclusions. Notice that this substitutional notion of formally good inferences need have nothing in particular to do with logic. If it's logical form that's of interest, then one must antecedently be able to distinguish some vocabulary as peculiarly logical. That done, the Fregean semantic strategy of looking for inferential features that are invariant under substitution will yield a notion of logically valid inferences. But if one picks out theological or geological or aesthetic vocabulary as privileged, then looks at what substitutions of non-theological, non-geological, or non-aesthetic vocabulary for non-theological, non-geological, or non-aesthetic vocabulary preserve material goodness of inference, will pick out inferences good in virtue of their theological form, their geological form, or their aesthetic form. According to this way of thinking, the formal goodness of inferences derives from and is explained in terms of the material goodness of inference, and so ought not to be appealed to in explaining it. Frege's inferentialist way of specifying the characteristic linguistic role in virtue of which vocabulary qualifies as logical, I'll talk about in a few minutes. So far, I've indicated briefly two related claims: that conceptual contents are inferential roles, and that the inferences that matter for such contents must be conceived to include those that are in some sense materially correct, not just those that are formally valid. I'll argue in a moment that commitment to the second of these, no less than the first, is to be found already in Frege's early writings, though not in the developed form to which Sellars brings it. But in both thinkers, those ideas are combined with a third, which I believe makes this line of thought especially attractive. In one of his early papers, Sellars introduces the idea this way. He says, quote, "Socratic method serves the purpose of making explicit the rules we have adopted for thought and action. And I shall be interpreting our judgments to the effect that A causally necessitates B as the expression of a rule governing our use of the terms A and B." End of the quote. Sellars understands such modal statements as inference licenses, which formulate as the content of a claim the appropriateness of inferential transitions. More than that, he understands the function of such statements to be making explicit, in the form of assertable rules, commitments that had hitherto remained implicit in inferential practices. Socratic method, he says, is a way of bringing our practices under rational control, by expressing them explicitly in a form in which they can be confronted with objections and alternatives, a form in which they can be exhibited as the conclusions of inferences seeking to justify them on the basis of premises advanced as reasons, and as premises in further inferences exploring the consequences of accepting them. In the passage I just quoted, Sellars tells us that the enterprise within which we ought to understand the characteristic function of inference licenses is a form of rationality that centers on the notion of expression, making explicit in a form that can be thought or said what's otherwise implicit in what's done. That's a dark and pregnant claim, but I believe it epitomizes a radical and distinctive insight. And in what follows, I hope to shed some light on it and its role in an inferentialist vision of things. The general idea is that the paradigmatically rational process that Sellars invokes under the heading of Socratic method depends on the possibility of making implicit commitments explicit in the form of claims. Expressing them in this sense is bringing them into the game of giving and asking for reasons, as playing the special sort of role in virtue of which something has a conceptual content at all, namely an inferential role, as premise and conclusion of inferences. That sort of rationality is distinct from, but obviously related to, the sort of rationality that then consists in making the appropriate inferential moves. Even totalitarian versions of the latter, for instance those that would assimilate all goodness of inference to logical validity or to instrumental prudence, depend on the possibility of expressing considerations in a form in which they can be given as reasons and reasons demanded for them. all the more does Socratic reflection on our practices, particularly on those material inferential practices that determine conceptual contents of thoughts and beliefs, depend on the possibility of their explicit expression. To begin to explicate this notion of explication, it's helpful to turn to a consideration of the young Frege's inferentialist program. Frege's Begriffsschrift is remarkable not only for the inferential idiom in which it specifies its topic, but equally for how it conceives its relation to that topic. The task of that work is officially an expressive one, not to prove something, but to say something. Frege's logical notation is designed for expressing conceptual contents, making explicit the inferential involvements that are implicit in anything that possesses conceptual content. As the passage I began by citing from the Begriffsschrift puts it, whatever is needed for a correct inference is fully expressed. Talking about this project, Frege says, quote, "Right from the start, I had in mind the expression of a content. But the content is to be rendered more explicitly in my Begriffsschrift than is done by verbal language. Speech often only indicates by inessential marks or by imagery what a concept script, Begriffsschrift, should spell out in full." End of the quote. His concept script is a formal language for the explicit codification and expression of conceptual contents. In the preface to the Begriffsschrift, Frege laments that even in science, concepts are formed haphazardly, so that the ones employing them are scarcely aware of what they mean, of what their content really is. When the correctness of particular inferences is at issue, this sort of unclarity may preclude rational settlement of the issue. What's needed is a notation within which the rough and ready conceptual contents of the sciences, beginning with mathematics, can be reformulated so as to wear their contents on their sleeves. The explanatory target here avowedly concerns a sort of inference, and the sort of inference involved is content-conferring material inferences, not the derivative logical and formal ones. Frege's early understanding of logic offers some specific content to the notion of explicitly expressing what's implicit in conceptual content, which is what's required to fill in a notion of expressive or elucidating rationality that might be laid alongside and perhaps even discovered to be presupposed by notions of rationality as accurate representation, as logically valid inference, and as instrumentally good practical reasoning. Before the fateful step from seeing logic as an attempt to codify inferences to see it as a search for a special kind of truth is made, which Dummett bemoans, Frege's aim is to introduce vocabulary that will let one say explicitly what otherwise one can only do implicitly. Consider the conditional, the first bit of logical vocabulary introduced in the Begriffsschrift. Frege says of it, quote, "The precisely defined hypothetical relation between contents of possible judgments, his conditional, has a similar significance for the foundation of my Begriffsschrift to that which identity of extensions has for Boolean logic." I think it's hard to overestimate the importance of this passage in understanding what's distinctive about Frege's Begriffsschrift project. After all, contemporary Tarskian model theoretic semantics depends precisely on relations among extensions, and Frege is saying that his distinctive idea in what is, after all, the founding document of modern logic, is to do things quite otherwise, to look at inferences rather than extensions. Well, why does he start with the conditional? Because prior to the introduction of a conditional locution, one could do something. One could treat one judgment, you could treat a judgment as having a certain content, implicitly attribute a conceptual content to it, by endorsing various inferences involving it and rejecting others. But after conditional locutions have been introduced, one can say as part of the content of a conditional claim, something that can serve as a premise and a conclusion in an inference, that a certain inference is acceptable. The conditional makes it possible to make explicit material inferential relations between an antecedent or premise and a consequent or conclusion. And since, according to the inferentialist view of conceptual contents, it's these implicitly recognized material inferential relations that conceptual contents consist in, the conditional permits such conditions to be explicitly expressed. If there's a disagreement about the goodness of an inference, it's possible to say what the dispute is about and offer reasons one way or the other. The conditional is a paradigm of elocution that permits one to make inferential commitments explicit as the contents of judgments. In a similar fashion, introducing negation makes it possible to express explicitly material incompatibilities of sentences, which also contribute to their conceptual content. So the picture is accordingly one whereby, first, formal validity of inferences is defined in terms of materially correct inferences and some privileged vocabulary. Second, that privileged vocabulary is identified as logical vocabulary. And third, what it is to be a bit of logical vocabulary is explained in terms of its semantically expressive role. So far, I've introduced three themes. That conceptual content is to be understood in terms of role in reasoning, rather than exclusively in terms of representation. That the capacity for such reasoning is not to be identified exclusively with mastery of some logical calculus. And third, that besides theoretical and practical reasoning, which uses contents articulated by their roles in material inferences, there's a kind of expressive rationality that consists in making implicit, content-conferring inferential commitments explicit as the contents of assertable commitments formulated using logical vocabulary. In this way, the material inferential practices, which govern and make possible the game of giving and asking for reasons, are brought into that game and so into consciousness as explicit topics of discussion and justification. These three themes, to be found in the early works of both Frege and Sellers, provide the beginnings of the structure within which modern inferentialism develops. And these ideas can be made more definite by considering a general model of conceptual contents as inferential roles that's been recommended by Michael Dummett. According to that model, the use of any linguistic expression or concept has two aspects: the circumstances under which it's correctly applied, uttered, or used, and the appropriate consequences of its application, utterance, or use. The original source for this model lies in the treatment of the grammatical category of sentential connectives. Dummett's two-aspect model is a generalization of a standard way of specifying the inferential roles of logical connectives due ultimately to Gensen. Gensen famously defined connectives by specifying introduction rules, or inferentially sufficient conditions for the employment of the connective, and elimination rules, or inferentially necessary consequences of the employment of the connective. So, to define the inferential role of the expression of Boolean conjunction, one specifies that anyone who's committed to P and committed to Q is thereby to count as also committed to P conjoined with Q, and that anyone who's committed to P conjoined with Q is thereby committed both to P and to Q. The first schema specifies, by means of expressions that don't contain the connective, the circumstances under which one is committed to claims expressed by sentences that do contain the connective, whose inferential role is being defined. That is, the sets of premises that entail them. And the second schema specifies, by means of expressions that do not contain the connective, the consequences of being committed to claims expressed by sentences that do contain the connective, whose inferential role is being defined, that is, the set of consequences that they entail. Dummett makes what seems to be a remarkable contribution to inferentialist approaches to conceptual content by showing how this model can be generalized from logical connectives to provide a uniform treatment of the meaning of expressions of other grammatical categories, in particular sentences, predicates, and common nouns, and even singular terms. The application to propositional contents, what's expressed by whole declarative sentences, is straightforward. What corresponds to an introduction rule for a propositional content is the set of sufficient conditions for asserting it, and what corresponds to an elimination rule is the set of necessary consequences of asserting it, that is, what follows from doing so. Dummett says, quote, "Learning to use a statement of a given form, then, involves learning two things: the conditions under which one is justified in making the statement, and what constitutes acceptance of it, that is, the consequences of accepting it." End of the quote. Dummett presents his model as specifying two fundamental features of the use of linguistic expressions, which is an idea I'll return to in a moment. In what follows here, though, I'll be applying it in the context of the previous ideas to bring into relief the implicit material inferential content a concept or expression acquires in virtue of being used in the ways that are specified by what Dummett calls these two aspects. The link between the pragmatic significance and inferential content is supplied by the fact that asserting a sentence is implicitly undertaking a commitment to the correctness of the material inference from its circumstances to its consequences of application. Now, understanding or grasping a propositional content is here presented not as the turning on of a Cartesian light, but as practical mastery of a certain kind of inferentially articulated doing, namely responding differentially according to the circumstances of appropriate application of a concept and distinguishing the proper inferential consequences of such application. Understanding in this sense is not an all or none affair. The metallurgist understands the concept of copper or tellurium far better than I do, for training has made her master of the inferential intricacies of its employment in a way that I can only crudely approximate. Thinking clearly on this inferentialist rendering is a matter of knowing what one is committing oneself to by a claim one makes and what would entitle one to that commitment. Writing clearly is providing enough clues for the reader to infer what one intends to be committed to by each claim and what one takes it would entitle one to that commitment. Failure to grasp either of those components is failure to grasp the inferential commitment that use of the concept involves, and so failure to grasp its conceptual content. Failure to think about both the circumstances and consequences of application leads to semantic theories that are literally one-sided. Verificationists, assertabilists, and reliabilists make the mistake of treating the first aspect as exhausting content. Understanding or grasping a content is taken to consist in practically mastering the circumstances under which one becomes entitled or committed to endorse a claim, quite apart from any grasp of what one becomes entitled or committed to by such endorsement. But that can't be right, for claims can have the same circumstances of application and different consequences of application. As for instance, when I say, I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel, on the one hand, and I will write a book about Hegel, do. We can at least regiment a use of foresee that makes the former sentence have the same assertability conditions as the latter. But substituting the one for the other turns the very safe conditional, if I will write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel, into the risky, if I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel. The possibility that I might be hit by a bus before I finish the book doesn't affect the assessment of the inference codified by the first stuttering conditional, but it's very relevant to the assessment of the second inference, which happily has turned out to be true, but might not have. At the point of the discussion of Seller's application of inferentialist ideas to the understanding of non-inferential reports early on in my talk, that point was that parrots and photocells and so on might reliably discriminate the circumstances in which the concept read should be applied, without thereby counting as grasping the concept, precisely in the case where they have no mastery of the consequences of application, when they can't tell that it follows from something being read that it's colored, that it's not a prime number, and so on. You don't convey to me the content of some toy concept glebe, say, by supplying me with an infallible glebeness tester, which lights up when and only when exposed to glebe things. I'd know in that case what things were glebe without knowing what I was saying about them when I called them that, what I'd found out about them or committed myself to by calling them that. Dummett offers two examples that aren't this silly, two examples of philosophically important concepts where it's important to be reminded of this point. He says, first, an account, however accurate, of the conditions under which some predicate is rightly applied may thus miss important intuitive features of its meaning. In particular, it may leave out what we take to be the point of our use of the predicate. A philosophical account of the notion of truth can thus not necessarily be attained by a definition of the predicate true, even if one is possible, since such a definition may be correct only in the sense that it specifies correctly the application of the predicate, while leaving the connections between this predicate and other notions quite obscure. End of that quote. But even more clearly, quote, a good example would be the word valid as applied to various forms of argument. We might reckon the syntactic characterization of validity as giving the criterion for applying the predicate valid to an argument, and the semantic characterization of validity as giving the consequences of such an application. If he's taught in a very unimaginative way, a student may see the classification of arguments into valid and invalid ones as resembling the classification of poems into sonnets and non-sonnets, and so fail to grasp the fact that an argument is valid provides any grounds for accepting the conclusion if one accepts the premises. We should naturally say he'd missed the point of the distinction. End of the quote from Dummett. So you can't identify meaning just with the circumstances of application. Pragmatists of the classical sort, on the other hand, make the converse mistake of identifying propositional contents exclusively with the consequences of endorsing a claim, looking downstream to the claim's role as a premise in practical reasoning and ignoring its proper antecedent upstream. Yet no one can know what follows from the claim that someone's responsible for a particular action, that an action is immoral or sinful, that a remark is true or in bad taste, without for that reason counting as understanding the claims involved, if one has no idea when it's appropriate to make those claims or apply those concepts. In the Army, being away without official leave does have the consequence that one is liable to be arrested, but the specific circumstances under which one acquires that liability are equally essential to the concept. Of course, such one-sided semantic theories don't simply ignore the aspects of content they don't treat as central. Dummett says, quote, most philosophical observations about meaning embody a claim to perceive a simple pattern. The meaning of a sentence consists in the conditions for its truth or falsity, or the method of its verification, or the practical consequences of accepting it. Such dicta cannot be taken to be so naive as to involve overlooking the fact that there are many other features of the use of a sentence than the one singled out as being that in which its meaning consists. Rather, the hope is we'll be able to give an account of the connection that exists between the different aspects of meaning. One particular aspect will be taken as central, as constitutive of the meaning of the given sentence. All other features of the use of the sentence will then be explained by a uniform account of their derivation from that feature taken as central. End of the quote. I think this is a very helpful way to think about the structure of theories of meaning in general, but there's two observations I'd like to make. First, The principle that the task of a theory of meaning is to explain the use of expressions to which meanings are attributed does not mandate identifying meaning with aspects of use. Perhaps meanings are to use as theoretical entities are to observable ones, whose antics they're postulated to explain. We need not follow Dummett in his semantic instrumentalism. Second, one might deny that they're meanings in this sense. That is, deny that all the features of the use of an expression can be derived in a uniform way from anything that we know about its meaning. Dummett suggests that this is the view of the later Wittgenstein. One who takes language to be a motley, in this sense, will deny that there are such things as meanings, to be the object of a theory of meaning. That wouldn't be to deny that objects are meaningful, just that they could systematically be derived from some one aspect of the use. Keeping these caveats in mind, we'll find that pursuing Dummett's notion of derivation provides a helpful perspective on the idea of conceptual contents articulated according to material inferences, and on the role of explicit material inference licenses, such as conditional statements, in expressing and elucidating such inferences and such contents. For the special case of defining the inferential roles of logical connectives by pairs of sets of rules for their introduction and elimination, the one that motivated Dummett's broader model, there is a special condition that it's appropriate to impose on the relation between the two sorts of rules. Dummett says, quote, "In the case of a logical constant, we may regard the introduction rules governing it as giving conditions for the assertion of a statement of which it's the main operator, and the elimination rules as giving the consequences of such a statement. The demand for harmony between them is then expressible as the requirement that the addition of the constant to a language must produce a conservative extension of that language." Close quote. Recognition of the appropriateness of such a requirement arises from consideration of connectives with inconsistent contents. As Pryor pointed out, if we define a connective, which we may call tonk, as having the introduction rule proper to disjunction and the elimination rule proper to conjunction, then the first rule licenses the transition from P to P tonk Q for arbitrary Q, and the second licenses the transition from P tonk Q to Q. And we have what Pryor calls a runabout inference ticket, permitting any arbitrary inference from any P to any Q. Pryor thought that this possibility shows the bankruptcy of Gensen-style definitions of inferential roles. Newell Belknap shows rather that when logical vocabulary is being introduced, one must constrain such definitions by the condition that the rule not license any inferences involving only old vocabulary that were not already licensed before the logical vocabulary was introduced. That is, that the new rules provide an inferentially conservative extension of the original field of inferences. Such a constraint is necessary and sufficient to keep from getting into trouble with Gensen-style definitions of logical connectives. But the expressive account of what distinguishes logical vocabulary, their special expressive role, shows us a deep reason for this demand. It's needed not only to avoid horrible consequences, such as we get with tonk, but because otherwise logical vocabulary can't perform its distinctive expressive function. Unless the introduction and elimination rules are inferentially conservative, the introduction of new logical vocabulary would license new material inferences, and so would alter the contents associated with the old vocabulary. So if logical vocabulary is to play its distinctive expressive role of making explicit the original material inferences, and so the conceptual contents expressed by the old vocabulary, it must be a criterion of adequacy for introducing logical vocabulary that no new inferences involving only the old vocabulary be made appropriate thereby. That's Dummetian harmony for the case of logical vocabulary. The problem of what Dummett calls a lack of harmony between the circumstances and consequences of application of a concept may arise for non-logical concepts, for concepts that have material contents, though. And seeing how it does provides further help in understanding the notion of expressive rationality and the way in which the explicitating role of logical vocabulary can contribute to the clarification of concepts. For conceptual change can be, as Dummett says, quote, motivated by the desire to attain or preserve a harmony between the two aspects of an expression's meaning. A simple case would be that of a pejorative term, e.g., Bosch. The conditions for applying the term to someone is that he's of German nationality. The consequences of its application are that he's both barbarous and more prone to cruelty than other Europeans. We should envisage the connections in both directions as sufficiently tight as to be involved in the very meaning of the word. Neither could be severed without altering its meaning. Someone who rejects the word does so because he does not want to permit a transition from the grounds for applying the term to the consequences of doing so. The effect of the addition of the term Bosch to a language which did not previously contain it would be to produce a non-conservative extension, i.e., one in which certain other statements which did not contain the term were inferable from other statements not containing it, which were not previously inferable. End of that quote. This crucial passage makes a number of points that are worth untangling. First of all, it shows how concepts can be criticized on the basis of substantive beliefs. If one does not believe that the inference from German nationality to cruelty is a good one, one must eschew the concept or expression Bosch. For one cannot deny that there are any Bosch. That's just denying that anyone is German, which is patently false. And one can't admit that there are Bosch and deny that they're cruel. That's just attempting to take back with one claim what one has committed oneself to with another. One can only refuse to employ the concept on the grounds that it embodies an inference one does not endorse. The prosecutor at Oscar Wilde's trial at one point read out one of the more hair-raising passages from his play, The Importance of Being Earnest, and said, "I put it to you, Mr. Wilde, that this is blasphemy. Is it or is it not?" Wilde made exactly the reply he ought to make, indeed the only one he could make, given the considerations presented here and the circumstances and consequences of the concept in question. He said, "Sir, blasphemy is not one of my words." End of the quote. Highly charged words are not the only sort of expression embodying inferences that require close scrutiny. As I've emphasized, the use of any concept or expression involves commitment to an inference from its grounds to its consequences of application. Critical thinkers, or merely fastidious ones, must examine their idioms to make sure they're prepared to endorse and so to defend the appropriateness of the material inferential transitions implicit in all the concepts they employ. In Reason's fight against thought debased by prejudice and propaganda, the first rule is that potentially controversial material inferential commitments should be made explicit as claims, exposing them as both vulnerable to reasoned challenge and as in need of reasoned defense. They should not be allowed to be curled up inside loaded phrases like enemy of the people or law and order. And it's in this process that formal logical vocabulary, such as the conditional, plays its explicitating role. It permits the formulation as explicit claims of the inferential commitments that otherwise remain implicit and unexamined in the contents of material concepts. Logical locutions make it possible to display the relevant grounds and consequences and to assert their inferential relation. Formulating as an explicit claim the inferential commitments implicit in the content bring it out into the open as liable to challenges and demands for justification, just as with any assertion. And in this way, explicit expression plays an elucidating role, functioning to groom and improve our inferential commitments and so our conceptual contents. a role, in short, in the practices of reflective rationality or Socratic method. But if Dummett was suggesting that what's wrong with the concept Bosch is that its addition represents a non-conservative extension to the rest of the language, I think he's mistaken. Its non-conservativeness just shows that it has a substantive content, in that it implicitly involves a material inference that's not already implicit in the contents of other concepts being employed. And outside of logic, that's no bad thing. Conceptual progress in science often consists in introducing just such novel, substantive contents and concepts. The concept of temperature was introduced with certain criteria or circumstances of appropriate application and other consequences of application. As new ways of measuring temperature are introduced and new theoretical and practical consequences of temperature measurements are adopted, the complex inferential commitment that determines the significance of using the concept of temperature evolves and improves. The proper question to ask in evaluating the introduction and evolution of a concept is not whether the inference embodied is one that's already endorsed, so that no new content is really involved, but rather just whether that inference is one that ought to be endorsed. The problem with Bosch is not that once we explicitly confront the material inferential commitment that gives it its content, it turns out to be novel, but that it can then be seen to be indefensible and inappropriate. It's a commitment we can't become entitled to. We want to become aware of the inferential commitments our concepts involve to be able to make them explicit and to be able to justify them. But there are other ways of justifying them than showing that we were already committed to them before introducing or altering those concepts. The circumstances and consequences of application of a non-logical concept may stand in substantive material inferential relations. To ask what sort of harmony they should exhibit is to ask what material inferences we ought to endorse, and so what conceptual contents we ought to employ. And that's not the sort of question to which we ought to expect or even welcome a general or wholesale answer. Grooming our concepts and material inferential commitments in the light of our doxastic commitments, including those we find ourselves with non-inferentially through observation, and the latter in the light of the former, it's a messy retail business. Dummett thinks that a theory of meaning should take the form of an account of the nature of the harmony that ought to obtain between the circumstances and consequences of application of the concepts we ought to employ, the good concepts. Moving up a level now, to apply these Dummetian considerations about the relations of circumstances and consequences of application to the contents of the concepts that we employ in the meta-language in which we couch a semantic theory, the point I want to make is that we should not expect a theory of that sort to take the form of a specification of necessary and sufficient conditions for the circumstances and consequences of application of a concept to be harmonious. For that would presuppose that the circumstances and consequences of application of the concept of harmony do not themselves stand in a substantive material inferential relation. On the contrary, insofar as the theory of semantic or inferential harmony makes sense at all, it must take the form of an investigation of the ongoing elucidative process of the Socratic method of discovering and repairing discordant concepts, which alone gives the notion of harmony any content, because it's given content only by the process of harmonizing commitments from which it's abstracted. In Sellers' characterization of expressive rationality, modal claims are assigned the expressive role of inference licenses, which make explicit a commitment that's implicit in the use of conceptual contents antecedently in play. Rules of this sort assert an authority over future practice and answer for their entitlement both to the prior practice being codified and to concomitant inferential and doxastic commitments. In this way, they can be likened to the principles formulated by judges at common law, intended both to codify prior practice, as represented by precedent, expressing explicitly as a rule what was implicit, and to have regulative authority for subsequent practice. the expressive task of making material inferential commitments explicit plays an essential role in the reflectively rational Socratic process and practice of harmonizing our commitments. For a commitment to become explicit is for it to be thrown into the game of giving and asking for reasons as something whose justification, in terms of other commitments and entitlements, is liable to question. Any theory of the sort of inferential harmony of commitments that we're aiming at by engaging in this reflective rational process must derive its credentials from its expressive adequacy to that practice before it should be accorded any authority over it. Well, in the first part of this talk, I introduced three related ideas. First, the inferential understanding of conceptual content. Second, the idea of materially good inference. And third, the idea of expressive rationality. The first of these contrasts with an understanding of content exclusively according to the model of the representation of states of affairs. I think I've managed to say rather a lot about conceptual content in this talk, but I didn't say anything about what's represented by conceptual contents. Second, the notion of materially good inferences contrasts with an understanding of the goodness of inference exclusively on the model of formal validity. And third, the idea of expressive rationality is supposed to be added to a notion of rationality as engaging in good reasoning practices, making good inferences. In the second part of my talk, those ideas were considered in relation to the representation of inferential role suggested by Dummett, in terms of circumstances of appropriate application of an expression or concept and the appropriate consequences of such application. And it's in the context of those ideas that I've sought to present an expressive view of the role of logic and its relation to the practices constitutive of rationality. That view holds out the hope of recovering for the study of logic a direct significance for projects that have been at the core of philosophy since its Socratic inception. Thank you for your attention.